Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. We're on the module A328. Well, block 4. We looked at block 2, 3, 2 and 3. How did empires begin? Now on block 4. How are empires experienced? This module book is a rather large book on module A328. Do you want an academic study of arts and humanities? But A328, Empires, Power, Resistance, and Legacies. Let's look into in-depth of our understanding. Block 4, How Empires Experience, edited by Carl Hack. Some of you may have come across his name in the previous module books. So here we have it. Introduction. Look at the aims. To learn about experience of empire by exploring carefully selected case studies in each unit. To engage critically with historiographical analysis of these experiences, to develop understanding of the various sources and methods historians use to study experiences of empire, such as history from below, reading against the grain and prosopography. Page 3, Experiences of Empire, a story of people. In the earlier blocks, you studied the origins and operation of a wide range of empires. You also tackled political, economic, legal, and other aspects of empire, and a system through which empire developed and gained strength. This block now changes focus to look at how individuals and groups experienced empire. In Unit 12, Katie Donington demonstrates how historians overcome the limits of the archive by reading against the grain of official records and using first-hand accounts to explore stories of slavery and resistance in the Caribbean. Unit 13 transports you to Australia, where Carl Hack illustrates some of the challenges in unlocking stories of First Peoples' experiences of and resistances to the arrival of the British Empire. The theme of resistance is continued in Unit 14, where Chris Williams and Samuel Aylett offer a series of African case studies to illustrate the variety of ways in which people resisted empire. Unit 15, Carl Hack employs a prosopographical approach, using collective biographies to illustrate how experiences of empire were shaped by sex and gender. And finally, in Unit 16, Vincent Trott takes a biographical approach to explore the lives of people who led their imperial careers that span multiple imperial locations. In writing about the experience of empire, we are also asking questions that are more personal and individual than those tackled in their other blocks. This raises question about typicality. To what extent can we generalize from the experiences of individuals? The reality is that there is no universal experience of empire. These units equip you with information and examples so that you can think about and analyze commonalities and differences across a range of imperial contexts. How are empires experienced? Approaches to writing about experience, sources, methods, language. Some key issues bring together all of the units in this block. Generally speaking, ordinary people did not record their experiences of empire for future generations of historians. This creates a challenge in recovering their stories, especially those of more marginalized people and groups, for example. While there is a wealth of primary source material available to help us see empire through the eyes of imperial elites, like General Charles Gordon. Unit 16, The Life of Sex Workers in Singapore, in Unit 15, are much harder to reconstruct. Our historical analysis changes depending on the questions we ask. When reading our sources, we can learn quite a lot about Gordon through a straightforward reading of official papers. But what about using official sources, for example, courts of or coroner's records, to tell us about the experience of those on the margins of society? Here is a straightforward reading that might not give us the information we want, but by asking the right questions, these sources can become rich treasure troves. What questions do historians ask of sources to glean information we want? But by asking the right question, these sources can become rich treasure troves. What questions do historians ask sources to glean information about people's experiences of empire, especially for those people who rarely had the opportunity to record their own experiences? If methodologies, historians of empire have used and developed methodologies to help them interrogate or read between the lines of different kinds of source materials. Historians of empire from below have sought to foreground the stories of what we might call ordinary or marginalised people in order to show how empire was experienced and shaped by people at all levels of society. To capture these stories, some historians also use prosopography, reading across a range of often fragmentary sources for information about many individuals to make claims about group experience. Oral testimony, as well as reading against the grain of official records. In the 1980s, the field of subaltern studies were developed by a group of South Asian historians, anthropologists, linguists, and sociologists who were determined to recover the voices of the people whose experiences and perspectives had not previously been deemed important. These scholars aimed to refocus attention on individuals and social groups traditionally excluded from the colonial and nationalist histories because of gender, race, wealth, language, religion, and or social class. The interdisciplinarity of the subaltern approach should tell you that scholars often have to think creatively in order to piece together unstable pasts. Through the block, we will pay specific attention to the source used in each unit and think about why and how historians use these sources. Throughout these units, you will notice how historians seek to push against the traditional great man histories of empire by trying to at least partially cover the voice of those who are marginalised out of our analysts of the past. Multifocality in historical discussions can give us an appreciation of how similar sets of events and periods were experienced by various people, colonizers and first peoples, men and women, people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and of different social classes. Given the challenges around source materials, how do historians try to capture or echo the voices of those whose perspectives and underrepresented in the sources? Agency constraint. Out one of the organizing themes of the mobile module is power. We may be tempted to be the Marxist notion that all people make their own history, but often not in circumstances of their own choosing. Power, political, cultural, financial, military, social, and more, is a key to understand empire. Resistance to that power in all of its forms is a significant part of the story too. Agency against empire was even more difficult to harness by women, underclasses, and marginalised groups. Throughout this block, you will see examples of how colonised peoples actively pushed against imperial constraints. In many cases, this was through organised movements and uprisings. For example, the women's tax riots against the colonial government in Nigeria. In other cases, individuals sought to undermine colonialism by exercising what little power they had. For example, enslaved people ran away from plantations in the British Caribbean on broke tools to undermine profit making by the enslavers. Different forms of the resistance produced different kinds of consequences for colonised people. How did people act? With varied forms of constrained agency, adopt parts of imperial imaginaries, and attempt to carve out space and resistance within these. Sex gender. These were key de- determinants of the experience of empire. Sexual behaviour was often tightly regulated through empire, either officially or through a set of informal social controls. Women and girls encountered empire differently to men and boys. A good example of this is the efforts to reduce venereal disease by restricting or regulating prostitution in the British colonies. These were almost always based on the assumption the local women were the source of infection. Imperial encounters shaped notions of sexuality for the colonised people and for those in the metropole. Unit 15 examines the experiences of non binary Hydras in India, the British imperial attitude towards homosexuality. How did sex and gender feed into imperial power dynamics? Where can we find resistance in these stories? When we look into the trauma, engaging with experience of empire means dealing with histories of trauma, including violence and death, sexual exploitation, and racism. Trauma is one lens through which we can see history of the empire, and it is important to acknowledge this. But trauma in the past has its legacies in the present. You might find some of these discussions quite challenging. We have indicated those selections where materials deal with particularly sensitive topics, especially where they do this using first hand or evocative accounts to judge whether you might wish to omit any sections or leave more time for them. You can also see the module guidance on studying emotive topics and developing emotional resilience. Language and concepts. Throughout the units in this block, the authors have thought carefully about the language they use. Employing the language and concepts specific to a culture or a time period can help you enter into the world as people experienced it. Unit 15 explores the practice of Irua, a feature of Kikuyu society in Kenya, which has the physical act of circumcising boys and girls, but also a culturally embedded act core to understanding age sets, hierarchies, and identities. Language as a system of representation is imbued with meaning, and we must be careful to understand where these meanings came from. We can then make informed decisions about the appropriateness of using these terms today. In Unit 12, Katie Donington refers to original source materials that include the language of race as used by enslavers. This language includes the written word and the visual language of racist images. She has included these sources so that you can understand the ways that enslaved people were represented and the power that came with being able to construct them as other. When writing in present, particularly when writing in their own voice, historians tend to minimize the use of offence terms that people used in the past. However, you'll find troubling material quoted in the module materials where it can eliminate the experiences of people and the system of power and resistance that shape those experiences. Think carefully about the ways that language and empire interacted to produce hierarchies of power in people's everyday lives. You should also consider the ways that language became a product of empire through creolization and offered modes of resistance to empire then and now. You have plenty to think about as your start of your study of Block 4. As with previous blocks, the trick is to consider each case study as a distinct example, while still challenging yourself to think across examples to find places where comparisons can be made to help you analyse experiences of empire. The Caribbean slavery, survival, resistance, and the making of freedom, 1760 to 1838. Page 13, look at the introduction. The theme of Block 4 centres on how people experience empires. This unit focuses on how enslaved people live through, with and in opposition to their enslavement in the British Caribbean to begin. I'll tell you a story that helps you to understand the famine approach and sources you'll be working with. On the 27th of December 1831, the missionary Hope Masterton Model 1804 to 1895 was preaching in all parish of St. James in Jamaica, but the enslaved congregation stayed away. All was alarmed, he wrote. As rumours spread of an armed insurrection, the people were terrified and said that the slaves were ready to cut off the head of any person who spoke a word in favour of white people. Pal Mayara, plantation on fire, they shouted, but it was not an ordinary estate fire they spoke of. Instead, it was a pre-concerted signal for our part of the country that struggle for freedom had begun. A flaming flag of liberty was created by enslaved people, burning down the trash houses, which were filled with dry, crushed sugar cane. As morning arrived, Waddell reacted on the terrible vengeance which the patient judges had at length taken on those sugar estates. The causes and scenes of their lifelong toils and degradation, tears and blood. Quoted in Model 1863, the Baptist War raged for 5 weeks and estimated 60,000 enslaved people. A fifth of the captive population took part, led by enslaved Baptist Deacon Samuel Sharp. It was the biggest rebellion in history of the British Caribbean. The emancipatory action was well organised and intellectually rooted in Baptist salvation thinking. Some participants, like Jack Paisley, drew on Western African traditions. He shared with his fellow conspirators that in Guinea country, when they want to fight, they put powder in the rum. Women actually participated in the struggle. Elizabeth Ball was sentenced to 24 lashes and 6 months imprisonment for inciting rebellion, according to her trial transcript. She had urged the enslaved to fight white people, chop them and cut them up. The death toll during the uprising was around 200. Hastily arranged civilian and military courts performed perfunctory trials, which lasted less than an hour before the verdict was delivered, and punishment was meted out. This led to further 340 people being executed, including 75 women. Additionally, 160 people were subjected to lashes ranging from 50 to 500. Others were incarcerated in the workhouse or transported off the island. Sharp was hanged on the 23rd of May 1832 in Montego Bay. He maintained that which the whites had no more right to hold black people in slavery than the black people had to make the white people slaves, and that he would rather die on yonder gallows than live in slavery. A year after the end of the Baptism War, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in Britain. Colonialism continued in Jamaica until 1962, when independence was won. The new government was free to decide how to interpret their history and construct a new sense of identity. They built monuments to honour the people they saw as symbols of their nationhood, and Sharp was designated as a Jamaican national hero in 1975. He has 2 memorials in Kingston and Montego Bay. Survival and resistance are key cornerstones for understanding how the history of enslavement has shaped Caribbean national identity. Memorials to the enslaved throughout the region function as a projection set in stone of these ideas. So how does the story of the Baptist War relate to how you study this topic? Women played an active role in the uprising, and during the unit you will consider slavery as a generated system. Men and women experienced slavery differently and had different stages for negotiating with the change in power. You will consider women's experience of labour, sex and reproduction. The rebels drew on African traditions, and you'll look at how African cultural identity was both preserved and creolized, creating new forms of expression. You will think about how enslaved people nurture their sense of self through religious practice, language, and dress, and how those acts of self-definition related to survival and resistance. The Baptist War was an example of violent collective activity, but the unit will also introduce you to other ways enslaved people subverted the system. Sharp was memorized in Jamaica. You will engage with how history of slavery has been represented and remembered in the Caribbean and Britain, and what that tells us about the relationship between memory and identity. Page 20. Black women were central to the functional slave economy. Popular representation of slave women as domestic workers, cooks, mammies, servants. They have distorted the reality that faced most of the women who were forced to work in Americas. Overwhelmingly, they were agricultural labourers. They undertook back-breaking field work necessary to produce sugar, rice, cotton, coffee, and tobacco. Barbara Bush has estimated that in the Caribbean, women made up to 50% of the field gangs. No exceptions were made for black women when it came to plantation work. They were deemed fit for labour rather than leisure. When Miss Carmichael published a book about her residence in St. Vincent and Trinidad, she described enslaved women as masculine, disgusting, and unimaginable. Hilary Beckles has argued that the demonization of black women was part of the ideological justification for the relentless extraction of their labour. How do we know what kinds of work enslaved women did? One of the key sources for understanding the structure of plantation labour was inventories that were created to account for the property belonging to an individual, frequently at death as part of probate. They included enslaved people who were listed as property alongside the value attributed to them based on age, gender, and occupation. From an examination of these records, we see gendered patterns of work. For enslaved men and women, skilled jobs on the plantation almost always went to men. Women were usually in unskilled or domestic roles. Some skilled work that men carried out afforded them a circumscribed level of freedom to move around the plantation more freely than those who worked tied them to the field and the house. If they were skilled, they might be permitted to leave plantation. If they were hired out to neighbouring planters, they could be potentially earn a wage if their owner allowed them to take additional paid work. The possibility of saving money meant the possibility of buying freedom. The uniform designation of the jobs to men rather than women created gender division of labour on the plantation. Hampton Plantation in Jamaica was owned by a Sterling family of Kier and Corder from the 1720s until the 1850s. They were plantation owners and West Indian merchants who operated from both Glasgow and Jamaica. In 1771, an inventory of the estate was created. Read the answer to the following question using the information. Transcribed version of his figure contents can be found on the module website. Enslaved women also worked in cities. Urban enslavement commonly meant working as domestics. Enslaved domestic servants cohabitated with the individuals that owned them. There was a danger that came with intimacy rather than anonymous field hand. These women were known by name and served in the most private capacities. They clothed, bathed, nursed, fed, and cleaned for their enslavers. If they broke a plate or spilled a drink, their mistake could be identified and punished. The increased visibility also meant that they could become targets of sexual abuse. This is brought with it both physical and mental toll. As there was no respite given the close quarters of a townhouse, enslaved domestics had to understand and navigate family relationships. And their chores continued day and night, all year round. Field labour was physically grueling, but domestic labour came with a different set of exhausting demands for enslaved women. Other forms of urban enslavement include shop, tavern, or hotel settings, and sometimes sex work. Enslaved women might also be part of a jogging gang. These were labourers that were unattached to land and were hired out to plantation owners to do the most physical, demanding work, such as digging holes for the sugarcane.